For most of human history, eye color was treated as a simple family curiosity, something you inherited the way you inherited a nose shape or a laugh, a private little accident of biology with no larger story attached to it. Grandparents traded theories over dinner tables about which side of the family the blue eyes came from, and geneticists themselves, for most of the 20th century, assumed eye color followed a fairly ordinary pattern of inheritance, the kind of trait that could pop up independently in unrelated families across the world without needing any deeper explanation. That assumption turned out to be wrong, not wrong in a minor technical way, but wrong in a way that reaches back through roughly 10,000 years of human migration, agriculture, and population movement, and connects almost every blue-eyed person alive today, whether in Reykjavik, Tehran, Minneapolis, or Melbourne, to a single individual who lived most likely somewhere near the Black Sea, not a population, not a region, producing the trait many times over. One person, one mutation, one moment in the genome, copied forward through hundreds of generations until it now sits quietly in thousands of people's cells, most of whom have never once thought to ask where their eye color actually came from. This is not a fringe theory. It is not something whispered about at the edges of genetics conferences or relegated to ancestry testing marketing copy. It is one of the more thoroughly confirmed findings in modern human population genetics, built on hard sequencing data, cross-checked across multiple independent populations, and replicated by research teams who had every professional incentive to find fault with the original claim, if fault could be found. Before 2008, if you had asked a geneticist why some people have blue eyes and others have brown, you would have received an answer built on the older, cruder model of eye color inheritance, the one many of us were taught in a high school biology class, using a simple dominant recessive Punnett square, brown eyes dominant, blue eyes recessive, two blue-eyed parents guaranteed to produce a blue-eyed child. It was a tidy model. It was also, as it turned out, substantially incomplete. The real biology of eye color is more layered than a single dominant recessive pair of alleles, and untangling it required looking not at the eye itself, but at the machinery that builds pigment in the first place. The color of the human iris comes down almost entirely to the amount and distribution of melanin, the same pigment responsible for skin tone and hair color, deposited in the front layers of the eye. Brown eyes contain a relatively large, dense concentration of melanin. Blue eyes are not blue in the sense of containing a blue pigment at all. There is no blue pigment involved anywhere in the human body. Blue eyes appear blue because they contain very little melanin, and the way light scatters through the low pigment tissue of the iris produces the visual effect of blue, the same optical phenomenon, incidentally, that makes the sky appear blue rather than transparent. The gene long known to be central to this pigment production system is called OCA2, and it had been on researchers' radar since the 1990s, largely because of its more dramatic role in a completely different condition. Professor Hans Eyberg first implicated the OCA2 gene as being responsible for eye color in 1996, and variants of that same gene, when more severely disrupted, cause a form of albinism, since OCA2 codes for a protein directly involved in melanin production throughout the body. Researchers understood, in a general sense, that OCA2 was involved in eye color variation. The breakthrough came from a research group at the University of Copenhagen led by Professor Hans Eyberg, whose team spent years working through the genetics of a large Danish family in an effort to pin down, at the bio level of individual DNA base pairs, exactly what was producing blue eye color and why it seemed to behave so consistently. Their approach, published in the journal Human Genetics in 2008, combined linkage analysis of the extended family with broader population sampling. And what they found reframed the entire question. The team discovered that the mutation responsible for blue eyes was not, strictly speaking, a mutation within the OCA2 gene itself. Instead, it was located in a neighboring gene called HERC2, in a small regulatory region that acts something like a dimmer switch sitting next to the OCA2 gene rather than inside it. Researchers discovered that the blue eyes mutation is actually in the HERC2 gene, which regulates the activity of OCA2, and the mutated HERC2 gene strongly inhibits OCA2's role in eye pigment production, drastically reducing the amount of melanin produced in the iris and resulting in blue eyes. Eyberg described the mechanism in strikingly simple terms. Originally, we all had brown eyes, he explained, and a genetic mutation affecting the OCA2 gene created a molecular switch that turned off the ability to produce brown eyes. Crucially, the switch does not shut OCA2 down entirely. A person with the mutation is not albino, and their body still produces some melanin throughout the rest of their skin and hair through the normal functioning of OCA2 elsewhere. This alone would have been an interesting piece of molecular biology, the kind of finding that clarifies a mechanism without necessarily reshaping anyone's sense of human history. But the more consequential Discovery lay in what the researchers found when they looked across large numbers of unrelated blue-eyed individuals, rather than just within the one extended Danish family they had started with. When a genetic trait has arisen independently many times throughout human history, the way, for instance, lactose tolerance has evolved separately in different populations in Europe, East Africa, and the Middle East, through different underlying mutations that happen to produce a similar functional outcome, you expect to see variety at the molecular level, different populations carrying the same visible trait, but arriving at it through different specific genetic changes, because there are many possible ways evolution can disrupt or modify a given gene to produce a broadly similar effect. That is not what Iberg's team found when they sequenced the relevant stretch of DNA in blue-eyed subjects drawn from populations with no obvious close relationship to one another. The authors found that one single haplotype, represented by 6 polymorphic SNPs covering half of the $3 end of the HERC2 gene, was present in 155 blue-eyed individuals from Denmark and in 5 and 2 blue-eyed individuals from Turkey and Jordan respectively. Not a similar mutation, not a comparable disruption achieving the same functional result through a different molecular route, given the sheer size of the human genome. This kind of precise molecular agreement across unrelated populations is not something evolution produces by chance twice. Human DNA is extremely long, with over 3 billion unique positions, and the scientists found that all of the blue-eyed people they examined had exactly the same genetic difference, in exactly the same place. The probability that this identical configuration arose independently and separately in Danish, Turkish, and Jordanian populations through pure coincidence is vanishingly small. Given how little variation there is in blue eyes at the genetic level, the researchers concluded that all blue-eyed people share this same mutation and descend from the same original blue-eyed ancestor. Every blue-eyed person you have ever met, the pale, ice-colored eyes common across Scandinavia, the lighter blue-gray eyes found scattered through populations in the Levant and Central Asia, the blue eyes that occasionally appear in families with otherwise entirely brown-eyed ancestry stretching back generations, all trace back through an unbroken chain of inheritance to one person, one genome, one specific and identifiable moment when a copying error in a strand of DNA quietly rewrote what human eyes could look like. Pinning down exactly when and where that first mutation occurred required a different kind of genetic detective work. Not just identifying that the mutation was shared, but estimating from the patterns of genetic variation that have accumulated around it since, roughly how long ago it must have first appeared. Mutations of this kind function almost like a molecular clock. The DNA immediately surrounding an ancient mutation tends to be inherited as a single block for a while, but over many generations, ordinary genetic recombination gradually chips away at that block, mixing in genetic material from other ancestral lines. The longer ago a mutation occurred, the more that surrounding block should have been broken up and diluted by subsequent generations of recombination. The more recently it occurred, the more intact that original genetic neighborhood should still be. Applying this kind of analysis, Iberg's team arrived at a strikingly specific estimate. The mutation seemed to have appeared about 10,000 years ago, with everyone before that point having dark eyes, and the first blue. E-eyes appearing during the Neolithic period, roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, when human ancestors left the region of the Black Sea for a better future and built settlements in northern Europe. It is a genuinely evocative image, somewhere in the hill country, bordering the Black Sea, among communities just beginning to experiment with cultivated grain and domesticated animals, in a population where every single person who had ever lived had brown eyes going back through the entire prior history of the species. One infant was born with a tiny, silent error in a regulatory stretch of DNA, an error invisible to anyone around them except in the one place genetics happens to write itself directly onto the visible surface of the body. That child's eyes would have looked different from every other human eye that had ever existed. What makes the Iberg team's dating estimate especially interesting is how neatly it lines up with independently established archaeological and genetic evidence about the actual movement of people during this period. The origin of blue eyes coincides with the period during which agriculture and associated populations were migrating out of the Near East and into Europe. This was not a slow, ambient trickle of individual families wandering north over centuries without any coordinated pattern. It was one of the major demographic events in prehistoric Europe, the spread of Neolithic farming populations, carrying with them domesticated crops, livestock, ceramics, and a substantially different way of organizing daily life into territories that had previously been occupied exclusively by Mesolithic hunter-gatherer groups. As these Neolithic farming populations expanded across the continent over the following millennia, they carried their genes with them, including, evidently, a genetic variant for blue eyes that had appeared, seemingly by chance, somewhere near its point of origin. Populations mixed, intermarried, and gradually spread the mutation further outward, generation after generation, until a trait that began in a single individual eventually became a defining and highly visible characteristic of entire modern nations. Estonia, for instance, currently has one of the highest rates of blue eyes of any population on Earth, and across Scandinavia and the Baltic states more broadly, the trait remains extremely common, a lasting genetic signature of exactly the kind of ancient population movement that this research has helped illuminate. The mutation did not stop at the edges of Europe either. The Iberg team's discovery that the identical haplotype turned up not just in Danish subjects, but also in blue-eyed individuals from Turkey and Jordan, suggests that the descendants of this single ancestor spread in multiple directions, not only northward and westward into Europe, but also outward through parts of the Near East and Central Asia, carried along whatever combination of migration, trade, conquest, and intermarriage moved populations through those regions across the subsequent millennia. None of this would carry much scientific weight if it rested only on a single research team's interpretation of a single dataset. Genetics, like every other empirical science, depends on replication, on other researchers working independently with their own samples and their own methodologies, checking whether an initial finding holds up or quietly falls apart under further scrutiny. In the case of the blue eye mutation, it has held up remarkably well. Subsequent studies examining the OCA2 HERC2 region across much larger and more geographically diverse populations have continued to confirm the central role of the same regulatory variant, identified by researchers using the shorthand RS1-913-832 in determining blue versus brown eye color. Among the single nucleotide polymorphisms tested, RS1-913-832 is a single DNA variation within a regulatory element of the HERC2 gene, and different SNPs within the broader OCA2 region are strongly associated not only with blue and green eyes, but also with variations in freckling, mole counts, and hair and skin tone, a reminder that this particular stretch of the genome functions as a kind of master dial for pigmentation more broadly, not just for eye color in isolation. Interestingly, more recent ancient DNA research has added a layer of complexity to the original timeline, without undermining the core finding of a single shared ancestral origin. More recent ancient DNA research has identified human remains considerably older than the Neolithic period that possessed the OCA2 mutation responsible for blue eyes. And it is now believed that the allele responsible for blue eyes may date back to the migration of modern humans out of Africa, roughly 50,000 years ago, entering Europe from Western Asia. This pushes the earliest possible appearance of the mutation back much further than the original 2008 estimate suggested, though the more commonly cited and more thoroughly documented explosive spread of the trait, the point at which it went from rare to common across large populations, still appears to align closely with the Neolithic agricultural migrations out of the Black Sea region. Additional research published in the years since has continued refining the picture, including a 2023 study examining a Norwegian population that identified individuals whose eye color did not perfectly match the simple model established by the original 2008 findings, suggesting that while the HERC2 founder mutation remains the dominant explanation for blue eye color across nearly all cases, a small number of additional genetic variants in the same region can occasionally produce blue eyes through slightly different mechanisms, or can modify how strongly the primary mutation expresses itself. Researchers sequencing the OCA2 HERC2 region in a Norwegian biobank population identified a study cohort of individuals who did not follow the dominant genetic hypothesis for blue eye color, despite having been genotyped with the same underlying HERC2 variant associated with blue eyes in the broader population. Identifying the mutation and dating its origin answered one question, but it immediately opened a much harder one. A single copying error appearing in a single ancient individual is, on its own, a fragile thing. Most new mutations of this kind simply vanish within a few generations, diluted out of existence by ordinary chance long before they ever have a shot at becoming common. For a trait to go from one carrier to a substantial fraction of an entire continent's population, within what is, on an evolutionary timescale, an almost absurdly short window of a few thousand years, something has to be actively pushing it forward. And on the surface, blue eyes do not look like the kind of trait that should receive that kind of evolutionary push. They confer no obvious hunting advantage, no obvious resistance to disease, no obvious edge in surviving famine or cold. If anything, the biology points in the opposite direction, since lower pigmentation in the iris typically comes with certain modest costs. This is precisely the mystery that has occupied researchers in the years since the original 2008 discovery, and it has produced a cluster of competing, occasionally overlapping theories rather than a single settled answer. The first and most straightforward explanation is genetic drift compounded by the realities of small, geographically isolated ancestral populations. In small founder groups moving into new, sparsely populated territory, precisely the situation facing early. Agricultural migrants pushing into the forests and river valleys of a mostly empty Europe, traits can become unusually common purely by chance, simply because a small number of founding individuals carrying a given variant end up contributing disproportionately to all later generations. A second and considerably more provocative explanation involves sexual selection, the idea that a trait can spread rapidly not because it improves survival, but because it becomes, for essentially arbitrary reasons, more attractive to potential mates. One recent theoretical model published in Frontiers in Psychology argues that blue eyes spread through exactly this kind of runaway process, proposing that the trait's rarity itself made it desirable, and that once a preference for blue eyes took hold within a population, the preference and the trait reinforced one another across generations in a self-accelerating loop, in much the same way that ornamental traits like the peacock's tail are believed to have evolved. Relative to the ancestral allele, the mutation that causes blue eyes is now present in proportions as high as 70 to 95% in Northern Europe, and at lower but still notable frequencies in Southern Europe, Southwest Asia, and North Africa, down to an appreciable 5 to 20% across Central and South Asia, a distribution pattern that theorists studying sexual selection argue is difficult to explain through drift alone, given how consistently the trait tracks specific regional gradients rather than appearing in scattered random pockets. Supporting evidence for a preference-driven spread comes from more recent behavioral research examining modern mate choice. Studies asking women and separately asking men to judge the facial attractiveness of potential partners who varied only in eye color found that people with light eyes themselves tend to show a stronger preference for light-eyed partners than people with dark eyes do. A pattern consistent with what evolutionary biologists call assortative mating, in which individuals disproportionately select partners who resemble themselves, gradually reinforcing a trait's frequency within a population over successive generations. A third theory, less romantic but grounded in more direct physiology, points to functional advantages tied to the environment early carriers of the mutation were moving into. As agricultural populations pushed northward into higher latitudes, they encountered long, dim winters and dramatically reduced sunlight for much of the year, conditions quite different from the environments their ancestors had occupied further south. Blue eyes filter light differently than dark eyes, since dark eyes, like dark skin, contain more pigment that can protect against sun damage, which may have made lighter eyes especially advantageous in the low light of northern European winters. None of these explanations are mutually exclusive, and most researchers working in this area today suspect the true picture involves some combination of chance founder effects, environmental pressures specific to the high latitude regions the trait's carriers were migrating into, and to self, reinforcing social and sexual preference layered on top of both. What nobody seriously disputes any longer is the underlying genetic fact that started this entire line of inquiry. Whatever combination of forces carried the trait from a single, ancient individual to a meaningful share of the modern human population, the molecular signature at the root of it all remains, in every documented case, the same one original mutation. The uneven global distribution of blue eyes today is itself a kind of living map of that ancient migration and its subsequent spread. And the numbers involved are more dramatic than most people who casually notice eye color day to day would likely guess. Blue-eyed people are estimated to make up roughly 8% of the global population as a whole, a modest minority set against the overwhelming global majority of brown eyes, which remains by far the most common eye color across every populated continent. But that global average conceals enormous regional variation. The gradient across Europe itself is equally telling, and researchers studying the sexual selection hypothesis have pointed to it directly as one of the more puzzling pieces of the puzzle. The frequency of the trait tends to run higher in populations that experienced greater genetic admixture, such as some southern European populations, than it does in parts of northern Europe. For example, the trait sits at around 25% in Italy, but under 7% in Norway and Estonia, even though northern Europe is precisely the region where the environmental and sexual selection pressures theorized to favor the trait are thought to have operated most strongly and for the longest uninterrupted period. This apparent contradiction, lower diversity of eye colors in exactly the populations where competing colorful variants might otherwise be expected to flourish, is one of the details current researchers cite as evidence that the trait's spread involves something closer to a rapid, near-total sweep through certain populations rather than a gradual, evenly balanced equilibrium between blue and brown. Perhaps the most genuinely surprising twist to emerge from ancient DNA research in the years since Eiberg's original study concerns the physical appearance of the very earliest known carriers of the mutation. Ancient genomes recovered from remains of some of the earliest post-agricultural Europeans have shown individuals carrying the blue eye. variant while still possessing notably dark skin pigmentation, a combination that looks unusual by modern standards, where lighter eyes and lighter skin are so often assumed to travel together as a package. There is something quietly startling about learning that a visible trait as common and unremarkable as eye color carries, embedded directly in its genetic mechanism, a traceable record of a single ancient individual and the subsequent movement of that individual's descendants across an entire continent and beyond. It is easy to think of most human genetic variation as diffuse and cumulative, the product of countless small changes accumulating gradually across an enormous, tangled family tree stretching back hundreds of thousands of years, with no single point of origin anyone could ever meaningfully identify. Blue eyes break that pattern in an unusually clean and legible way. Here's a trait where the genetic evidence allows scientists to say, with real confidence, not just how the mechanism works, but approximately when and where it began, and roughly how it subsequently spread. It also offers a small but genuine window into just how recent in evolutionary terms a huge amount of visible human variation actually is. Anatomically, modern humans have existed for roughly 200,000 years, and for the overwhelming majority of that time, by the current genetic evidence, at least until sometime in the range of 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, or possibly considerably earlier, depending on which dating estimate ultimately proves more accurate, every human being who ever lived had brown eyes. Blue eyes are, on the timescale of the species as a whole, an almost startlingly recent development, arriving well after humans had already spread across every inhabited continent, developed complex language and symbolic culture, painted the cave walls at Lascaux and Altamira, and begun burying their dead with intention and ritual. The Black Sea region where this mutation most likely either originated or first began its dramatic expansion was, at the time, home to communities standing at the very threshold of the agricultural revolution. People beginning to plant deliberate crops and tend deliberate herds for what may have been the first time in human history, in the same general window during which one of their number, or one of their close descendants, happened to carry a small invisible copying error that would eventually put a distinctive light-colored ring around the pupils of a substantial fraction of humanity. None of this required anyone to search for a hidden anomaly, or to interpret ambiguous instrument readings, or to argue for one contested reading of the evidence over another. The genetic data here is about as clean and as widely replicated as population genetics gets. A single identifiable regulatory mutation present in exact molecular identity across geographically dispersed populations, dated by independent methods to a period. That lines up coherently with known patterns of ancient human migration. It is, in its own quiet and understated way, one of the more remarkable pieces of evidence connecting a trait you can see in the mirror every morning, directly back to a specific, if anonymous, human being who lived on the shores of an ancient sea and whose descendants eventually carried a small accident of biology to every populated continent on Earth. So the next time you notice a pair of blue eyes, your own, a friend's, a stranger's on the street, it may be worth remembering that you are looking at something considerably older and considerably more specific than an ordinary family trait. You are looking at the still visible, still inherited legacy of one person, one mutation, and one migration that began somewhere near the Black Sea roughly 10,000 years ago and has been quietly, faithfully copying itself into new generations ever since.